I put up the book for you.
Yes, so today I was back on the bandwagon, but
Do you want a lectern? We usually have a no notes.
I mean, I actually want
The mic here. I'll put it there when I come back. I'm impressed.
see my computer.
Yeah, of course. Good evening, everyone. All right. Wow, another full house. This is great. I talked to somebody at the door who said, I thought this was free. And I said, no, that's Café Scientifique that's free. The science faculty has more money than the humanities faculty. So they just pay the bill, and we have to ask for a ticket price. But on the other hand, apparently the science one isn't usually full, whereas you guys are filling this room. So thank you very much for coming tonight. This is valuable, I hear. I completely agree with you. And we're kind of talking about science, history of science. So welcome to our first Café Historique talk of 2024, and the fourth in our series on the history of everyday life. The last two talks, so the first Wednesday in March, is going to be Rachel Cleave's. Her new title is A Brief History of Humanity in 10 Foods. She is a food historian. That's a good one. And Christine Obonsawin, first Wednesday in April, will be talking about the history of the modern Olympic Games. Now, I won't be here for those two because I'm lucky. I get to go on a research trip to France. So I will be missing you. I'll probably tune in on the streaming version, maybe, if I'm thinking about work at all. But my colleagues will be here to guide you through the process and everything. But just, be aware that it's going to be a different face at the desk, but everything should run smoothly. They're both veterans of the talk series as well. So our speaker tonight, David Zimmerman, is no stranger to this lecture hall. How many people have heard David speak before? Raise your hand. Right? Yeah, a lot of people. Exactly. He wants me to tell you that I tricked him into this. However, if by tricking, what he means is that I asked really nicely, and he always says yes whenever I ask him to give a talk, then yes, I tricked him into it. David has given a number of talks for us. He gave a talk in my travel series on Normandy and the D-Day beaches, if you remember that one. He also gave one called Flash Gordon versus Hitler. And I'm sure you're sad to have missed that one. And then last year, actually, he gave his talk on refugees from Hitler. You might have remembered that talk as well. So traditionally, David is a Canadian and European historian, and he's a specialist in military history. So, for example, he has studied science and war. He studies technology. A couple of his older books, Britain's Shield, Radar, and the Defeat of the Luftwaffe, Maritime Command Pacific, the Royal Canadian Navy's West Coast Fleet in the early Cold War. So he teaches the Second World War course, which always has a wait list at UVic. If there is one course that 20-year-old boys want to take, it is the World War II course. It's always full to the brim. He also teaches the history of technology, war and society, and he has developed a really wonderful project called the Veterans Oral History Project, where they have recorded the stories of about 800 Canadian veterans. The students then take a course where they go through what oral history means, what it means to collect information for history that way, and if they're lucky, they get to actually interview a veteran as well, or else they work from the recorded materials. His more recent turn in scholarship has been towards academics who were trapped in Hitler's Europe in the 1930s. So Jewish academics, communists, and the efforts to rescue them. So this was the topic of his talk last year, and that book has now come out. Is it up here? It is, Ensnared Between Hitler and Stalin, Refugee Scientists in the USSR. So that came out with U of T Press in 2023. And he's currently hard at work. He puts me to shame. He writes so much. I'm so impressed by my colleague, David. His current project is going to be called Scholars in Flight from Hitler, a much broader treatment of that same topic. So that's going to be fantastic. But this talk tonight, if we can flip back to the title. Oops. This talk tonight, I asked David to borrow from his knowledge and his expertise in the history of technology. So tonight he'll be talking about progress as a concept throughout history. So please join me in welcoming David Zimmerman.
Hi, can everyone hear me in the back? Excellent, excellent. Jill is a liar. She really did trick me. I said to her, can I give a talk on automobiles? And she said, no, John Lutz is already doing that. And then she said, what about bicycles? And I said, well, I could give a talk on bicycles, but it's actually one of the 2 lectures I have in my repertoire where I sing. So rather than not hurt any of you, I decided to avoid that one. My wife is up cheering that, I'll have you know. But actually, when she talked about the theme, I wanted to talk about something quite a bit different. It's actually one of the major themes of my History of Technology course, which I'm currently teaching, History of Technology since the Industrial Revolution. And it's the idea of progress. So I came up with this idea. I knew it wasn't completely original, but I actually knew nothing about it. But I thought I'd start off by looking to see if anyone had actually used that term before. And thank goodness it's been used. It's used a lot, but I actually, doing the magic of Google, found a definition from a encyclopedia put out by Stanford University of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And I thought, oh good, philosophers are much more serious than me as scholars. And this is what this encyclopedia says. Philosophical proponents of progress assert that the human condition has improved over the course of history and will continue to improve. Doctrines of progress first appeared in 18th century England and epitomized the optimism of the time and the place. Belief in progress flourished in the 19th century. While skeptics of progress did exist alongside its supporters from the beginning, it was not until the 20th century that theorists backed away en masse from the notion. Many 20th century thinkers rejected the notion of progress after the horrendous events such as the 2 world wars, the Holocaust, and the use of nuclear weapons. I guess the evil 3 events of the 20th century. And I looked at this and I said, it's not bad, except for that last sentence, which shows philosophers should stick to philosophy and not history. But I like that because it really does give the concept the power of this very idea and how it has shaped our society. And I just want to give you one example. Now, first of all, please don't anyone run to the media or to the university ethics office or anything like this. And I do this in my first class in the History of Technology is I undress all my students. Now hold it, I tell them, no clothing will be parted. But I tell them that I bet you I can make you completely naked because I'll remove everything from your body that isn't the product, that is everything from your body that is a product of the post-1750 world. And no matter what you have on, I will get you naked. Even if you have a hand-knitted sweater, I will remove it because I'll ask you about the dyes, or I'll ask you about how was it spun, or I'll ask you how it was, even the wool was carded, one of the cleaning processes. And unless you tell me you did everything absolutely by hand, nothing you would have can go back before 1750. And one of the things is we are linked to the period of what happened in Britain beginning in about 1750. And we are connected to these people far more than we are to all those people that went before. Now, this is a very materialistic view, but it also shapes our intellectual concepts, our basic social norms as we understand it. And someone came up to me just before this talk and said, what do you think about cell phones in the classroom? And I said, great idea. And he looked at me aghast, retired teacher. And I said, you should see the way my granddaughter uses her phone in the classroom. David Eby, and I'm not going to say anything about David Eby because I will get arrested if I say anything about him. But he wants to take these phones away, which my granddaughter is now using to take a photograph of the blackboards, or it's on whiteboards, so she knows absolutely certainly what her assignment is for. Right? Phones aren't useful in the classroom. They're bad. No, they're not. And this is a view of technology that is is this constant struggle between what's good and what's bad in technology. Now I'm just going to go back to this slide here, because I had this up before. I'm going to talk about this image, why it's the most important image in history. And I phrase this very importantly, but we're going to get to this image. And it's not a quiz, but we're going to get to it. So this, of course, all begins in the so-called Industrial Revolution. Now, the first thing I want to point out to you, there is actually no such thing as the Industrial Revolution. It's not like anyone went running through the streets shouting, "It's the Industrial Revolution! Everyone hide! The machines are coming." The fact of the matter is, the term Industrial Revolution wasn't invented until later in the 19th century, when they were looking back at what had happened, the extraordinary things that had happened. And it was, I think he's an economist or economic historian named Arnold Toynbee, who coined the term the Industrial Revolution. That this was something that extraordinary had happened. There's a lot of these, by the way, imaginary revolutions, like the Agricultural Revolution, the Information Revolution. Now, the American Revolution happened. The French Revolution definitely was an event. Ask Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, right? It had a sharp edge to it. Sorry, that was bad. But the fact of the matter is, people knew that something had happened. And of course, Karl Marx, the least funny of the Marx brothers, although Zeppo gave him competition, sorry, that was bad as well. And there's not going to be a lot of humor in this, so I got to put it in here. And his sidekick, Engels, saw, of course, in this period, the emergence of the proletariat, the factory worker, who no longer owned the means of production. That's all very nice. But the fact of the matter, there was much more happening than the Marx brothers, no, just the Marx, and Engels saw. And the fact of the matter is, the Industrial Revolution, just very quickly, because I have a lot of material to go through, is involved rapid technological change, much more rapid than it ever happened in any previous time, and involved the new basic building material, iron, new fuels and energy sources, coal and steam, new machines rapidly transforming old industries, most notably in the 18th century, the textile industry, and new machines led to a new means of industrial organization called the industrial factory. And I emphasize industrial, though I don't have it on the screen, because there were pre-industrial factories, but I'm not going to talk about them because I don't have time. Now, there's no question that contemporaries in the early 19th century understood that they had just lived through a great change. Patrick Calhoun, the Scottish merchant, statistician, and policing pioneer before Robert Peel, he created the first police force in Britain, the Thames River Police, I think they were called. And he wrote in 1814, the year the War of 1812 ended, "It is impossible to contemplate the progress of manufactures in Great Britain beyond any other nation within the last 30 years without wonder or astonishment." Or Robert Owen. How many of you know who Robert Owen was? No. A few of you do. He was a great pioneer, socialist, industrialist. Amongst other things that some people say he invented was the concept of a free state education and the concept that children should actually get taught how to read and write. And he wrote in 1820, "It is well known that, during the last half of the century in particular, Great Britain, beyond any other nation, has progressively increased its powers of production by rapid advances in scientific improvements and arrangements introduced more or less into all the departments of productive industry throughout the empire." So these people, the contemporaries, knew that something dramatic had changed, that they were living in a brand new world. And of course, they're British, so they can say, "Ha, see, that's why the world's most powerful nation. We just defeated Napoleon Bonaparte, defeated the ideas of the French Revolution, and we are now this great state, the world's great superpower, with our mighty industry and, of course, their empire." So let's look at how people saw this change. And I'm going to show you some images here. And this is a beautiful little pastoral painting, a rural perfection. And it's actually an engraving from 1758 based on a painting by the artist Thomas Smith. And this is showing you this lovely scene But it's only if you actually understand what this is about. These buildings here are changing the entire world. They're the place where a guy by the name of Abraham Darby, the first, there were 3 Abraham Darbys, that confuses my students, father, son, grandson. And Abraham Darby, the first, was the first man to realize you could use something called coke, which is, of course, carbonized coal, iron ore, and limestone in a blast furnace, blasting air through with the bellows to mass produce iron in quantities that could never, prior to that, been achieved. And allowing you not only much more iron, but even to make much larger things out of iron. And this is where this is happening. Now, why this showing such beautiful calmness here? It's an attempt by Abraham Darby, the first son, Abraham Darby the second, who's on the verge of bankruptcy, to raise money from investors. And he says, look, isn't this beautiful here? Wouldn't you like to invest in my ironworks? Look how lovely they are. So let me show you the next image, which is probably the most important image of the very first part of the Industrial Revolution. This image. This is in the same place, Coalbrookdale in Shropshire in England. It's just about a mile away from where that first painting was. It's 50 years later. And it's still the company of the Darby family. It's owned now by Abraham Darby III. And this great painting called Coalbrookdale by Night by Philip James de Loutherbourg, who is a French refugee painter. And he paints this painting here. And when you look at this painting, this captures the new industrial age, the new age of progress. Now, Richard Warner, who actually accompanied him on his trip to Coalbrookdale, because this site became a tourist attraction for people to go to see, this new industrial age. And Richard Warner, who's a writer and priest, described Coalbrookdale in 1801 as a scene in which the beauties of nature and processes of art are blended together in a curious combination. Now, that's a curious description. But what he's actually trying to say is there's tremendous beauty here. There's unbelievable power here. But there's also maybe a little bit of a sense of foreboding here. And I think this is captivated. The very notion that people are working right through the night. Why? Because once you get a blast furnace going, it takes you weeks to get it going. You got to run it 24/7 until you have to shut it down to fix the bricks inside of it, which you do maybe once a year. You don't stop. That's the reality of the industrial age. But it's not all negative. Despite the way this looks, it's actually very positive that we can light up the night sky with the products of this industrial age. And Abraham Darby III, the grandson, he builds using the iron from his mill. And by the way, the furnace that he builds, in this case, this is a little bit further away from his granddad's furnace. This is called Bedlam. And I think it's related, will eventually relate to the insane asylum in London. But Bedlam is right down on the river. And the reason it's right down on the river, you can't quite see it here, is so when they cast huge pieces of iron, they can move them by water to wherever they need to be. And where they go is here, just a little bit down the river. And this is, in this beautiful pastoral scene, right, there's this contrast. Harsh industrialization and wonderful rural scenery. And this little quaint image here, this structure here, is the most important structure ever built, because it is the first major structure ever built of iron. It is the Iron Bridge. Okay? I went to Iceland a few years ago, and one of the geysers there is simply called Geyser, because it's the first one they knew. This is the Iron Bridge. And this is a description of the bridge from 1780. The amazing structure was cast at Coalbrookdale in the year 1778 and erected in the year 1779 and 1780. The expansion of the arch is 100 feet within, and its height 45. which, with the additional height of the walls it is supported on, makes near 55 feet from the water. The whole bridge is computed to contain 500 tons of iron. It now stands as indisputable proof of the abilities of our mechanics and workmen. This bridge would have been impossible before the age of iron. And this bridge, it was so new. You see how it sort of goes up in the center? Like this? It's because they tried to build it like a stone bridge with a keystone. Because that's how they knew how to build the bridge. And they attached the pieces of iron using the techniques of carpenters. Because that's how they knew how to put things together. And this bridge, although it stood for 200 years before they realized it was about to collapse, the problem is that all the weight of the iron is in the center. And that's how you build stone bridges. Iron, you actually want to pull them back to the sides. And eventually what they did in 1970, they put steel cables underneath the river here to both sides to pull the bridge and hold it up. But it's still there. They can't take cars across it, but you can walk across it. Now this iron bridge became a symbol of this new age. And there's all sorts of examples. This is a snuff box with the bridge on it. This is a clock face with the bridge image on it. A ceramic tray and a trade card from an ironmonger in Birmingham, I believe it is, because, this represents the Iron Age and this guy sells iron. If you want this magical new thing, come to me and maybe you can build your own bridge. So it's an extraordinary structure. And, of course, this is only part of the Industrial Revolution. Because one of the other really important aspects, which I just don't have time to go into much detail, is the development for the first time in history of power, which could be created regardless of location, nature, or horsepower. Because remember, the reason we measure, at least in the English system, engine power by horsepower is because that's what they measured against, because that's what they had before the steam engine. And let me see if I can get my video to play. Are we ready with the sound, I hope? Okay.
Let's fire it up.
You may recognize this guy. He has his own steam engine.
This is about the speed it would run back in the day. It's interesting. People kind of get the misconception that machine shops back in the late 1800s were noisy places. They weren't. Steam was very quiet. I mean, you hear how much noise this thing is making, hardly any at all, just a little bit of creaking. And once it warms up and everything gets really hot, it's almost completely silent. What you're hearing right now is mostly metal expanding and contracting until everything gets warm. But this would run all day long. This engine ran, I'm told, for almost 100 years before Henry Ford bought it. So, no, he bought it in the 20s. All right, 80 years, about 80 years, yeah. Ignore the wizard behind the curtain. That's Jim back there. He's the Wizard of Oz. He's running the throttle. The throttle valve is really just a steam valve. You open or close it. I mean, you see how slowly you can run these. You can run these literally down to about 5 RPM. But they like to run about maybe 120 RPM, something like that. The interesting thing about it is it was built in 1832, built in England, but we don't know who built it because they didn't put their name on it. But they did a beautiful job. Your piston is in here. So this will come and, hit you in the... Notice the Napoleonic, or the Greek columns, rather. These were really sort of the space shuttles of their day, and they wanted to be as intricate and beautiful as possible because they wanted to show off the technology of the day. When you look at modern machinery, it's very efficient, but it's not pretty, and this is really, I think, a beautiful piece of early 18th century artwork. It's what you call your walking beam up here. These are lubrication points up here. You fill these with oil and those drip down. This is your lubricator. This fills with oil and sends oil into the cylinder. Water, obviously not a lubricant. So what that does, it puts a little dollop of steam oil into the piston on every stroke. This is what people did before television. You'd sit down and you just watch your steam engine run all day. And it's a fascinating thing to look at. This is your governor. What this does is, as the centrifugal weight throws the balls out, that controls your throttle so you don't overrev the motor. This is where the famous expression balls out comes from. Balls to the wall, that's another whole different one. But balls out comes from steam engines. We had to make a couple of new pieces. This was cracked.
Okay.
So we
Enough of him. Now, first of all, I have to say this is actually a really funny video, if you know what you're looking for. It's not operating on steam power. Okay? There would be all sorts of steam. Funny enough. It's all fake. I think it's a real engine, but you may know he has this incredible collection of cars. He's not going to dirty them with the steam engine. And so he's converted to run either on electricity or pressurized air, so it can be clean. And everything he said about it was almost completely wrong. And in fact, including, what did he say? That the flyball governor, which is the round things that you saw spinning around these balls, controlled the throttle. No, it did not control the throttle. It released the steam pressure. And that's what I really want to show you, because as faster the engine goes, these balls go up, they open a valve which releases the steam pressure, preventing the steam engine from blowing up. So one of the aspects of this first industrial age, how sophisticated they were, they developed the first automatic safety devices so this technology doesn't kill people. Because when it starts killing people, people don't want to use it. Okay, and another incredible thing also came out of this age, which is really part of our world.
well, here, let's
Let's get rid of him. Is, in fact, they have developed basic computer programming in 1800. Now, this didn't actually happen in England. It happened in France with the Jacquard loom. Let's see if we can get this to work. Think we can? This is an application of the same technology.
Then push this down till it snaps.
You see these
Play
big
button, that's it.
wooden cards here with the holes in them? Okay, enough of Queen. But the point of the matter is this technology, to be able to store and use information, existed by 1800. So the basic components of the information age is actually already in place. That's extraordinary. Now, as we move into the 19th century, we have emergence of a new group of people who I have called the generals of the age of progress, the civil engineer. And the term civil engineer actually only goes back to around 1750, when it was coined by a couple of British surveyors who said we can also supervise the building of things. Of course, there have always been military engineers. And this was a craft in the 18th and 19th century, often passed down from father to son. Although in one example, the Roblings family, which built the Brooklyn Bridge, it was passed from father to son. Father died, not uncommon for these engineers to die. Son was crippled by the Bends building the Brooklyn Bridge, and we now know in a recent study the bridge was completed under the supervision of Mommy Robling, unfortunately name I forget, the wife and mother, who actually learned her engineering from her from her husband. So it's quite extraordinary. In the 19th century, engineering gradually becomes a new profession. And this is an account of the first really famous civil engineer in Britain, John Smeaton, who died in 1793, and this is his biography. The first really great Victorian engineer, or even pre-Victorian engineer, is Thomas Telford. Now, one of the things about all these guys, they're all self-taught. They often come from the most humble backgrounds. And Robert Southey, the poet laureate at the time, called him the Colossus of Rhodes. Notice the spelling. And the Pontifex Maximus, referring to bridges. He was the son of a shepherd, trains as a stonemason. He teaches himself engineering and builds over 1,000 miles of roads, canals, and structures. By 1792, he begins designing bridges and aqueducts. And he builds over 100 of them, including, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce this, it's in Welsh, Pontypridd Aqueduct, to bridge the gap between two canal systems over a gorge. It still operates today for people doing tourism on canal boats. And this bridge, the Waterloo Bridge in Wales, and perhaps most famously, the road to Holyhead, which is that island off the coast of Wales, which you go to if you're going to take the boat to Ireland, where he built the road which allows the stagecoaches, still the era of the stagecoach, to get much more quickly from London to Holyhead to go to Ireland. And he built these magnificent bridges. And one of the things is the sense of aesthetics of the Victorian engineer, or of the engineers of the 19th century, still before Victoria. Because there's Conway Castle, there's the bridge to look and blend in with Conway Castle. Here's the bridge today. There's the somewhat later railway bridge here, and there's the modern road bridge. Look, the two older bridge, which actually tried to blend in with the castle here. And that was the notion that progress needed to blend in with the sense of romantic aesthetics. So here's Telford here, and this is his most famous bridge. Still exists. You can still drive a car over it. Last time I was there. The bridge over the Menai Straits, which connects Anglesey to the Welsh mainland. It's an extraordinary structure. The reason this bridge is so important is because you had to be able to get over this water, and people in Vancouver may be familiar with this. You actually have to allow ocean-going ships to get under. And of course, in the age of sail, that was a big deal. And so to be able to bridge this gap, he invented something called the suspension bridge. You may have seen a few of those in Vancouver. And this is the classic portrait of the successful engineer of the age of engineering. Here's Telford sitting with his best suit on. In the background is one of his structures. And they're always pointing at a plan, the next plan they're working at. So certainly after Telford goes, we get into a whole new age, because now we get into the age where steam is applied to motion. The age of steam power. The great pioneers, the father and son team of George and Robert Stephenson. George Stephenson, like so many others, self-taught. He started off as a colliery foreman, which meant he shoveled coal in the steam engine at the coal mine in order to keep the mine pumped out. But he went to night school, and he learned how to read and write and became an engineman, which meant he ran the engine. And at night, when no one was looking, he took the engine apart to figure out how it worked, and he put it back together again the next morning. And he figured out how we could make engines. And then from that, he became a civil engineer. In 1825, he built the first railway that works. There have been other earlier railways called the Stockton and Darlington Railway. It wasn't commercially successful. Technically, it was successful. And trains could travel the extraordinary speed of 24 kilometers an hour. Yeah, it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you had a horse to compare it to, it was pretty fast. And I'm not going to read this eyewitness account, but I just want to say there's all these extraordinary eyewitness accounts where people, by the way, came from all over, as far away as they could for a day. And at the opening of this railway, there was something like 40 to 50,000 people who walked or rode horses to see this railway operate for the first time. And everyone was astounded, including, as this description says, even the animals were astounded by it. Now, it wasn't a commercially successful railway, but the next railway the Stephensons got involved in was successful, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. And the railway itself was designed by George Stephenson, but his son Robert. And George sent his son to Edinburgh University to get a really good science education, the best you could get at the time. Edinburgh was the greatest science school in Great Britain, not Oxford or Cambridge. They taught boring things like theology. And they had a test when this railway opened in October 1829. And they actually invited 3 different engine designers to submit their engines, and they built them and they ran them along the track to test which was the best one. And the one that won hands down was Robert Stephenson's engine, this little engine here, the Rocket. And this transformed the world. Everyone came from all over Britain to see this railway in operation, including the British cabinet, the Duke of Wellington. He had a special train. And at one point, everyone gets off the train because they're refueling, they're getting water and coal in. And everyone steps off the train, and they can see one of the other locomotives coming down the track in the distance. And everyone goes, well, we better get back into our train because we're pretty close to this other track. let's get in. And everyone jumps into the train except for one of the senior politicians who represents the area, William Huskinson, who doesn't understand something moving at a final rate of 20 miles per hour. And he doesn't get off in time, and he's knocked down by the other train coming the other direction, pushes him underneath the train, and it cuts off his leg, one of his legs, and he later dies. Actually caused a political nightmare for the British government because he was really very important in the British government. It also shows that technology can be really dangerous if it's not used right. I mean, one of the very, very early railway accidents. But where I want to go to, of all the engineers I'm going to talk about, it's probably the archetypal engineer of the age of engineering, and this is a guy by the name of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. I love that name. Isambard, family name. Kingdom was his mother's name. He used it because she was English. And his dad's name, who was also an engineer named Mark Isambard Brunel, Mark Brunel was a Frenchman who ended up in England after the French Revolution and was an engineer himself, another father and son team. So I'm not going to have a chance to talk about Mark, although he's very interesting. But Mark sent Isambard to France at the age of 14 to learn mathematics, because the greatest engineering schools in the world were the French polytechnics. And his son came back, age of 17, goes to work with his father, and by 1830, age 24, Isambard takes on his first major commission as an engineer. And this is this structure here for the city of Bristol, the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which bridges the Severn Gorge, connecting the two parts of Bristol that had never been connected before. And it's a technical success, except they run out of money while it's being built. And the bridge, in fact, takes from 1830 to 1864 before it's completed. You can still go there, you can still drive a car over it, it's still there. But the bridge took so long to complete, Isambard was already dead by the time his first commission was finished. But the reason they ran out of money is they had a much more important idea. To make Bristol an important city, they needed a railway, the newfangled railway, to link them to the metropolitan center to London. And Isambard won the contract to build the first real intercity railway between Bristol and London here and Bristol here. I should get it right. And Isambard has to invent the whole science of building a railway, including, because the early steam engines really weren't very powerful, to build tracks that had nothing much more than a 1-degree slope, because they couldn't go up much greater slope. And so massive engineering works where they used thousands of workers, they called the navvies, to build things like this cut to reduce the slope as it went up a hill. And this had steam engines pulling the debris up. Most of the digging was done by hand, by pick or shovel. And where necessary, they would use gunpowder as explosives. At one place, they couldn't just dig into the ground. There was a massive hill they couldn't get around called the Box Hill. And so Isambard said, well, why don't we just drill through it? And he built what was at the time the world's longest tunnel. Extraordinary feat. People told him this is absolutely impossible. And he said, absolutely, I can do it. And they started from either direction, and they also dug shafts on the top of the hill down, and they lowered people into these shafts, and they began to dig. And eventually they had as many as 4,000 workers, or navvies, and navvies, I hear, is incorrectly spelled. There should be 2 V's. Bad proofreading. And it took 4 years for them to complete it. They used a ton of gunpowder to blast through the rock. Gunpowder is very dangerous. And in fact, they often didn't evacuate the workers when they blew up because it was too time-consuming. And 100 of these workers, these navvies, died. It was, and this is very common for these early engineering projects, for huge numbers of people to die. But the tunnel worked. When the east and west portions of the tunnel met, it was out, the alignment was out by less than 5 centimeters. That was better than, by the way, the Channel Tunnel was when they completed the Channel Tunnel. Now, one of the things that Brunel brought in, though, one of the things about these engineers, what's really important about them, is how they were bringing in all sorts of different ideas. And one of the things that Brunel brought in was it's not just important to have this new choo-choo train on tracks. But you have to have a method of communicating, particularly to keep track of these ferociously fast-moving engines at 20 miles an hour. Because sometimes they might be on the same track heading towards each other, and you don't want that. So how can you keep track? Well, why not use the newfangled invention of the electronic telegraph invented by the American Samuel Morse in 1843 and his Morse code? And Brunel also said, well, look, we have this right-of-way with tracks on it. Wouldn't that be a great place to put the telegraph wires? We can use it to keep the train safe, but we can also use it to make money for the railway by having people, if they want to send message instantaneously at the speed of light, they can send a message from London to Bristol. And this has all sorts of wonderful applications in all sorts of fields like business. Now, Brunel also had to invent, well, what do you do at either end of the engine? There's going to be thousands of people. So he invented the great terminus railways. And this is Paddington Station, as it was completed. This is not the station that's there anymore. This is Bristol Station, which also I don't believe exists. I believe it was destroyed during the Blitz in 1940. But these huge terminal railway stations and hundreds of other stations along the line all had to be built. As well, people are going to now be traveling. They have to have places to stay. So let's build hotels at the railways. You know, railways and associated with hotels, we don't know about that. Something called the Empress wasn't built by the Canadian Pacific, right? And here's this hotel. The Paddington Hotel does still exist. It's now the Hilton Hotel. Look at the spectacular dining room to have your meal. So people can now travel, and this invented tourism. Because people who usually didn't go more than about 5 miles away from where they lived in their entire lives, unless they were forced to migrate for economic reasons, now could go on a day trip to see the Carlisle races from Newcastle. Or they could go even for a weekend to France by train to Dover from London and then a steamer across to that foreign and alien land where Jill's going. And as well, you have to build entire towns to house the workers, including these massive engine works. So you build beautiful workers' houses with stores and pubs and a mechanics institute. What is that? A technical education school that people could go to either during the day or at night, because they needed all these new technical experts to build and maintain all the equipment for the railway. And his shows this impressive notion of the power of this new technology. This is the great Joseph Turner's painting, The Great Western Railway. And it's described, a steam engine comes towards us as it crosses the Maidenhead Railway Bridge in the rain. Designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the bridge was completed in 1838. And that's from the British National Gallery. Now, Brunel didn't stop there, of course. How do you connect Bristol with the rest of the world? Well, you use the new technologies to build ships. And he built a series of 3 ever-increasingly large vessels, pushing the envelope of what's possible, even though Brunel has never designed anything, not even a canoe, before. And his first ship, the Great Western, is the first ocean liner. And when I say the first ocean liner, one of the keys about having an ocean liner is that by powering vessels by steam that can actually travel by steam across the Atlantic Ocean. And the Great Western, his first ship, is the second ship to go across the Atlantic Ocean on steam power alone. But the first ship, which beat the Great Western by just a couple of days, they ran out of fuel off New York, and they burnt everything wood on the ship. Brunel's ship arrived with bundles of coal left in reserve. And once you have this, finally sailing ships, wind is fickle. Steamships can operate on a set schedule. Suddenly people can actually buy tickets in advance. They can travel across. They can buy tickets to go home. And this begins widespread international travel across the oceans on a regular basis. The next ship is the Great Britain, the first large vessel built of iron. He's always pushing the envelope. One of the things about these engineers, they're always pushing the limits of the technology. This ship weighed over 3,500 tons. Huge ship. The Victory, the flagship of Nelson and Trafalgar, came in at about 1,500 tons. It was the first with the new technology of screw propellers, which defied common sense, because not only are you building out of iron, which should sink, right? who would put iron into the ocean. But you have screw propellers, which means you have to cut a hole in the bottom of your iron ship. That's stupid, but use another new product called rubber to seal the screw shaft so the water doesn't flood in. And screw propellers are about 5 or 6 times more efficient than the old-fashioned paddle wheels. Great ship. It still survives, by the way, to this day. It was found and restored many years ago, and it's in the dock. This is the same dock. It's now there as a museum ship. You get to Bristol, you can see the Great Britain. But Brunel's greatest ship was the Great Eastern. Now, this was actually Brunel, I think, losing his mind. It was designed for the Australian wool trade. It was a massive ship. It was 15,000 tons, by far the world's largest ship. In fact, it was so large it wouldn't be exceeded as the world's largest ship for, what do I say there? I think I say for 40 years. Now, the problem was it went beyond the engine technology of the time. And even though Brunel put everything on, including giant paddle wheels and screw propellers, he had like 10 engines or something in the ship, it didn't work very well. And in fact, traveling on a sailing clipper ship to Australia was much quicker than this white elephant, as it became known. And here's Brunel himself. Here's the construction. Notice the anchor chains here. You've seen these before, because here's why I say this is such an important image. This is Brunel as a young man, how they would have imagined, how they would have presented him to the world. Classic pre-Victorian image of the successful engineer. Remember the Telford image? This is the picture of Brunel just days before he died with the Great Eastern, the anchor chains of the Great Eastern. This picture sells us so much. First of all, it's a photograph, right? Secondly, look at the size of these chains compared to him. But this is the model of a successful engineer. And of course, there's a link here to Canada. You notice the hat? Beaver. That's why we exist, it's beaver. And of course, the final fruition of this age of progress is the Great Exhibition of 1851, where the British celebrate their accomplishments. It's the world's greatest industrial power of the age of progress. Now, I can't tell you the story now, but somewhere in this massive building, prefabricated building of iron and glass, which was designed to be taken apart like a Lego set and was later moved to South London, where it survived till it burnt down in the 1930s. This incredible building, the largest structure ever built with internal space at the time, in there, one of the exhibits would show that the British industrial power was going to be eclipsed by this pesky country called the United States, but that's another story. So there is a BC dimension to all this. You guys may know this guy. He's been villainized, probably rightfully, as a really nasty guy, but he's also one of these Victorian engineers. And he goes off to British Columbia, Joseph Trutch. And he learns from a great Victorian engineer by the name of Sir John Remy, who himself had learned from Brunel. He worked on the Great Northern, Great Western Railways in Great Britain. Of course, we remember him for his racist policies against First Nations in BC. But he came to BC and he built roads. He was invited there, by the way, by a British Army engineer by the name of Moody. You may have heard of him. And he builds roads, and he builds a suspension bridge, the Spuzzum Suspension Bridge. The bridge that's still there, by the way, is not the original bridge. This bridge made Trutch an extremely wealthy man because the tolls were charged. It was the only way across the Fraser Canyon. But he did more. Trutch originated the idea of a transcontinental railway. He went to Ottawa to negotiate British Columbia's entry into Confederation. And from 1880 to 1889, he supervised the construction of the CPR for the Canadian government. So, these guys were incredibly important. They not only built Britain and the British Empire, they built the province of British Columbia. Even if we don't like the guy, that's what he did. Now, there was always a sense of nostalgia about this passing age, what was passing. And this is probably the most famous painting of the first half of the 19th century, probably a British painter, another Joseph Turner painting, who I've misspelled, the Fighting Tamar. And that's this massive sailing ship back here, which was with Nelson at Trafalgar in 1805, a British ship of the line, a battleship. And she was being towed away to be scrapped by this fire-breathing dragon, a steam tugboat. And it depends whether or not you consider this scene to be sundown or sunset, whether it's reflecting and being saddened by the past or welcoming in this new modern age, right? Both views are together. So finally, let me finish up. The idea of progress, is it always progressive? Many 20th century thinkers, according to our definition I read at first, rejected the notion of progress after horrendous events such as the 2 world wars, the Holocaust, and the use of nuclear weaponry. That is absolutely totally false. The philosophers shouldn't write history. Because right at the time these things were happening, there are people that opposed this new age of progress. Now, the most famous group that most of us have heard of is the Luddites, because it comes a word in the English language. They actually didn't hate technology. It's a completely misinterpretation. In fact, it's interesting. You go look at the Wikipedia definition of Luddites, it's 100% wrong. The Luddites were not against technology. They were against a particular technology that challenged their craft monopoly over the making of stockings. And the particular frame they were objecting to had been invented during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I 200 years earlier. And they've been fighting against lesser skilled people using this knitting frame to make stockings for 200 years. So that's the machines they attack, not the modern industrial machines. The real word we should use for people who hate technology and wish to destroy it are the saboteurs. That comes from Belgium, where the Walloons threw their wooden shoes, their sabots, into the industrial machines that were taking away their livelihood. The fact, and this is actually a Luddite, a poster from the Luddite riots or attacks on these knitting frames, where the citizens or the burghers of Nottingham order and staggering 50 guineas reward for information leading to the people that have destroyed the knitting frames. And there was violence, right, in 18th, 19th century Britain, not just from the Luddites, but other groups that attacked technology that threatened them. The reality is technological change or progress is winners and losers. For instance, the group that really lost weren't the Luddites, but were the weavers. The weavers were wiped out. Of course, these were skilled male craftspeople, almost exclusively male. The women did the speeding and the spinning and the carding. It was a family organized business model. But the weavers lost their livelihood, became destitute. Many of them had to do something like only the lowest of the low would do. They joined the British Army to make ends meet. Children, we all know they suffered in the Industrial Revolution, right? They did, but compared to what they had come from in the 18th century, it may not have been that bad. And that's part of the things that Marx doesn't tell you about, is that, in fact, the 18th century wasn't a utopia living on the farm. There were things like famine and freezing and all sorts of other problems that you had. And children, in fact, didn't exist, some historians have argued, before the industrial age. They were just considered to be little people that contributed to the family's income. But there's a whole new group of people, often coming from the lowest of the lowest classes, the mechanics, the engineers, and they all had one thing in common: literacy. And literacy was the key to success. And from the early works of Robert Owen, that socialist industrialist, comes the concept by the end of the 19th century of a universal state-funded education, at least enough to get you literate. There's also, and really almost my last point, because I think I'm almost out of time, is that there are really some really horrific social consequences of this age of progress. One of the most bizarre ones, unintended social consequence of progress, is the invention of this device here by this man here, the cotton gin. And the cotton gin is based on this machine here. This is a machine invented in the 18th century for textiles to clean wool. It's called the carding machine. Seems very simple, but it increased by 10 times the speed of cleaning and pulling the fiber for the first time. And Eli Whitney saw one of these carding machines, and he said, I bet you we can use this to get cotton seeds out of cotton. And the big problem with cotton is it was so labor intensive, no one could mass produce it. Well, once you get this machine here, in the deep south of the United States, you know why they included slavery in the Constitution? Was because they thought it was a dying thing. And it was, because the tobacco industry was failing due to the destruction of the environment caused by the tobacco crops, they thought what would happen in the South was exactly what happened in the North. Eventually, slavery would go. But suddenly, you could mass produce cotton, and if you had free labor, these slaves, you could sell this to the huge cotton mills that would come up in England and make a bundle. And so he reignited slavery. It's pretty horrific. Of course, the results of this later lead to the greatest war in the history of this continent, the American Civil War. Now, one last point. The environment. Because this is today a very common topic. And so for my very last point, I want to point out that not everything is clear-cut in terms of talking. You may know this, talking about the environment. For instance, we may decry the use of coke and coal to make iron and to use for heating. But what it also did is save what few forests there were left in Europe from complete deforestation. Because all you had before you had coal and coke was wood and charcoal. Discovery of petroleum products in the mid-19th century saved the whales, which are being exterminated for whale oil. That's what Jay Leno didn't tell you, that the oil that dripped into his steam engine should have been from whales. Yet even in the early 19th century, people were aware of the destructive effects of progress. Long-term costs of progress are often overlooked. And very recently, some geologists have actually argued, and other scientists have actually argued, that because of our burning of these fossil fuels and other products, we've created a whole new geological age, the Anthropocene or the Technocene. There's an argument about which term to use, and there's an argument about when it started, but I think 1750 is a good bet. And of course, but despite the fact we actually have totally altered our environment with this age of progress, we continue to search for technological solutions. And how many of you came in an electric car this evening? The solution to all our problems is an electric car, which actually solves absolutely nothing, I hate to tell you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry I've gone on so long. I can take questions if we have time. Do we have any time? I'm happy to field it myself. If you can shout out the question, I will repeat it in the mic, and then I'll attempt to answer it, or I'll pretend not to. Any questions? Yes.
And I can't remember the comedian's name, where he was showing his steam engine.
Jay Leno, yes, yes.
He said it was very quiet. If he had been running it on steam, would it have been more noisy?
Yes, and in fact, the whole thing is nonsense, because the noise in a place using a steam engine for power of machinery were the belts that took that power to the machine. And that's what happened to people in industrial factories. They got, children lost arms and fingers and heads in those belts because you can't plug in a machine powered by steam. You have basically these huge rubber bands that connect everything through wheels to the machines. So the industrial factory of those era were incredibly dangerous, not just because of the machines, but more so because of the drive belts, which were everywhere throughout the factory. And the noise was horrendous. I've been in some of these plants that have survived, and even though they usually have only a small proportion of the machines, when they're running, you can't hear yourself think. It's noisy. And the steam engine itself is noisy, and it's shooting steam out all over the place. Any other questions? Yes?
What can you tell us more about the correlation between aesthetics and technology and making it beautiful?
Oh, gosh. The correlation between aesthetics and technology. All I can tell you is this. In the Victorian era, they would have said that there is no separation. That what we want to build is something that's beautiful because it's showing the power that we have unleashed in our age of progress. And I'll give you an example. Coalbrookdale, which is the center of the 18th century revolution, which is now the Iron Bridge World Heritage Site. Coalbrookdale became famous in the 19th century when iron production moved to other places which had bigger deposits of coal and iron. It became famous for making intricate cast iron for things like fences, ornamental cast iron, was what they did throughout the 19th century. In fact, they still do it to this very day. It also became the center of very high quality ceramics as well. So in the Victorian era, they didn't separate the two. It had to be practical and it had to be beautiful. Just the reality of their world. Any other questions? Yes.
Having visited Ironbridge, one of the things that was brought out in that visit was the importance of the Quakers in furthering social organisation. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, of course, the Darbys were all Quakers, right? And the role of the Quaker industrialist was central, particularly in the 18th century revolution. I'm not sure you can go too far with the Quakers because there weren't a lot of them, and they were very quickly eclipsed. But there certainly were, in terms of the Darbys, an appreciation that you had to look after your workers. They were important, and they were also human beings. But the whole idea, these early industrialists, people like Richard Arkwright, who I actually left out of this talk, who was the most successful industrialist of the 18th century, and Robert Owen, built model utopian villages for their workers. Okay? Now, they weren't Quakers, but they understood that sort of same basic philosophy. And this whole notion that all industrialists are the evil people, figures of Marx and Engels, isn't really true. Now, when you get into the 19th century with massive industrial cities emerging like Manchester, you get these industrial slums, which are pretty horrendous places to live. And a lot of the disconnect comes in there of having to look after the workers. Although I'd have to say, it's from those horrendous conditions, it's some of the most important developments of progress occur, such as the concept of public health, the building of sewers, of clean drinking water, the end widespread disease. London, you may not know, but in the 18th century, fewer people were born in London than came into London every year. And so many people died in London, but still the city continued to grow exponentially, and it wasn't an industrial town. People were fleeing off the land to get in. So I found a little bit off track here, but the problem with technology, if you're looking for just all bad or all good, you're looking the wrong way. And so progress isn't about good or it isn't about bad. It's about what drove everything forward and what led to the changes that took place. And certainly there were individuals that really were far different than the model of the industrialists. I will make one other point, though, about this. One of the weavers, and those are the group that I said really lost their livelihood at the time, was a Scottish weaver. His last name was Carnegie. And he migrated in destitution to Pennsylvania. He had a son named Andrew. And Andrew became the greatest robber baron in history. Andrew Carnegie, the founder of U.S. Steel, the richest man in the world in 1900, who then, in order to try to get into heaven, gave all his land away to charity. And the fact is that a son of a destitute weaver became the great industrialist of the Gilded Age of the United States as an extraordinary development of this sort of Horatio Alger story, the rags to riches story. Bit off topic of the question, but there, I got in some nice points. Any other questions? Yes.
I noticed that early on they had suspension bridges.
Mm-hmm.
And so that implied steel cables?
No, initially they were iron chains.
They were iron?
Iron chains. In fact, if you go to Budapest, it's actually not real because the real bridge was destroyed in the Second World War. The great historic bridge over the Danube, which linked the city of Buda and Pest and became Budapest, was designed by one of these Victorian engineers, and it's called the Chain Bridge because it was held up by iron chains. That's how they did it. Before they invented steel cable, which really doesn't come out until about 1860, with the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, they use iron Or in some cases, like in North America, the Roblings, their first suspension bridge was over the Niagara Gorge. They used rope, very thick rope. Now it eventually fell down. But still, there were other things they used. We tend to think of steel, but steel is not yet available in large quantities at this time. Yes?
Can you comment on the evolution of the idea of progress between the time when men were in charge of the machines and the time, perhaps more recently, when the machines are becoming in charge of men?
Well, you want to know what happened when machines became in charge of men. I always say the people that say that are the people that have lost. Because there's always someone in charge, it just isn't you. And the fact of the matter is, and that may be different with AI, but as I say, one of the problems of the Industrial Revolution, and when you look at the Industrial Revolution, you're always talking about the losers, the poor weaver. Well, the poor weaver meant if you were an average person, you had 2 sets of clothing, your Sunday clothing and the other days. That's it, right? And then eventually your Sunday clothing would become your other days if you could afford another suit, if you could. So there are winners and losers. And people always, look at themselves and they say, well, my life has changed in a negative way. And I agree, technology has that implication to many people. But the reality is there's always this group of people that have benefited from this. I mean, I think Bill Gates would always say, oh, yeah, I'm pretty good here. I'm okay. But there's many more people than Bill Gates that have benefited from this sort of revolution of electronics and of computing. And so, again, we have to be careful about the way we look at these things. And we tend to be driven, a large measure, really people on the left are driven by this sort of Marxist analysis. I don't know what to say. I wrote about a group of people that went to the Soviet Union looking for the Marxist paradise. They didn't find it under Stalin. And all I can say about it is, we have to be more realistic. I think we have to be less ideological in the way we look at things. And we have to understand the real complexities of societies as they change, because progress is constantly speeding up the change. And I'll just say maybe this one last thing. One of the things I tell my students, in the age of the dinosaurs, when I was 10 years old, and I'll be 65 in 2 weeks or so, I say to them, my family had a phone in the hallway. It was black. It had a dial on it. It was attached to the wall with a wire. The big news was when we got a phone upstairs or one in the kitchen attached to the wall, we had 2 phones. Then I tell them, one day we suddenly could get a white phone, okay? And then next thing we know, we got buttons, which made funny noise. We had to pay more for that. And then finally, as we're getting out of the age of the dinosaurs, the beginning of the age of the mammals, we get cordless phones. Remember those first generation of cordless phones? Anyway, it goes on and on and on. You know where I'm going. Till we have our smartphones, which have more computational power than all the computers used for NASA during the Apollo space missions, right, in our pockets. And the fact of the matter is our progress is accelerating dramatically. And the thing is that people today, and at least I think I am as well, we are used to this so much that we hardly even notice it's happening. It's when you notice that it's happening or you can't deal with it that you know you have problems. My mother-in-law's 92, my mother's 90. They both talk to their children regular basis using Messenger. They have no problem using their iPads. Okay? They have adapted to this age of progress. The question is, can you? And that's the real trick. It's really difficult, I know. Okay. How are we doing for time, Jill?
I think that's a really nice note to end on.
Oh, I thought so. I thought. Thank you.
Okay, well, that wraps up our evening for tonight. Keep an eye on your inboxes for, wow.
Sorry about that.
Okay. For Rachel Cleeve's talk in March, I wish you a pleasant evening then, and I will be toasting you from the Seine. All right, good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.